I always believed we know the heart of the one we choose to walk beside. I believed that looking into his eyes was enough to tell when he was telling the truth. It was like that for many years. I felt secure, as though I had a home with solid walls where nothing bad could enter. And maybe that is why it hurt so much to realize he was not everything I thought he was. Are you curious to find out how it all happened? Then subscribe to the channel now and leave a comment telling me where you're listening to this story from. I love to know where you're following me from. And look, if I were you, I wouldn't miss what's coming up. The truth I'm about to reveal will move you in ways you can't even imagine. Are you ready? In those days, marriage was meant to be for a lifetime. We learned to endure, to forgive, to look past the things that wounded us. No one taught us that sometimes forgiving is just another way of fooling yourself. I grew up hearing that a good woman was the one who held the house together and never caused a fuss. So when the first signs came, I chose to keep quiet. I remember the first time he came home late, with no explanation. It was a night of full moon, and I was sitting on the porch with my embroidery in my lap. The clock had long since marked the hour he should have been home. When I heard his footsteps, my heart jumped. I wanted to ask where he had been, but the question died in my throat. He passed by me with a good night that sounded strange. I pretended not to notice. That night was when my silence began. Then came other absences, other poorly told excuses. He said it was work, that it was business, that he was tired. I nodded, but each time my chest grew heavier. I fell asleep and woke up with that feeling that something was wrong. And even so, I did not have the courage to speak. Many people might think it is weakness, that a woman who stays silent in the face of betrayal makes herself small. But I know it was not a lack of strength. It was fear. Fear of losing everything I had built with so much effort. Fear of seeing my whole life collapse before a truth I already felt but did not want to confirm. I began to notice details I once overlooked. The scent of a perfume that was not mine. The way he avoided my eyes when he came in. The clothes washed in a hurry, as though he wanted to erase traces. Every small sign was a needle prick. But I took a deep breath and told myself it might only be my imagination. The curious thing is that from the outside, everything looked the same. The neighbors came for coffee and said I was lucky to have such a hard-working husband. I smiled, served the cake, and pretended that our house was a picture of happiness. And, in a way, it was. But it was a happiness made of silence, of pretending, of fear. I was afraid of being judged, afraid they would say it was my fault, because there is always someone ready to point a finger at the woman, as though a man's infidelity is the result of the wife's lack of care. I preferred to endure in silence rather than give reason to those who wanted to see me defeated. But silence did not make me stronger. It made me shrink inside. I woke in the middle of the night and stared at the ceiling, thinking I deserved more, that it was not fair to live beside someone who did not choose me fully. And still, day after day, I kept quiet. It was as if my voice had dried up. But deep down, I already knew what I would do. While he thought he was deceiving me, I was preparing my heart. I would not be the woman who caused a scandal, who slammed doors and screamed. I would be the woman who looked him in the eye and said what needed to be said without lowering her head. I began to gather my courage in silence, like someone gathering wood for winter. I knew the day would come to use every word I had saved. I wanted him to think I did not see, that I was the distracted wife, too busy with the house and children to notice the scent of another woman's skin. Because the more secure he felt, the clearer I saw the truth of who he was. And when the moment came, he would have nowhere to hide. Many think the worst part of betrayal is the lie itself, but I learned that the worst part is the feeling that you were no longer enough, that the love you gave with an open heart was not enough, and that is what eats away at you inside. It is not his lack of honesty. It is the lack of an answer to the question that lingers. Why wasn't I enough? For a long time, I believed my silence was cowardice. But now I understand that sometimes silence is only the preparation for courage. I needed to keep quiet to gather strength. I needed to keep quiet to understand that I was not the one who was wrong. I needed to keep quiet until I was ready to speak in a way he would never expect. That is how I decided. I would pretend not to know. I would pretend until my voice returned whole. And when it returned, it would be my reply. Not a plea for explanations, not a lament, but proof that no woman ever needs to live small to keep up the appearance of happiness. And it was like this, in the silence only I could understand, that I began to become another woman. I always say the truth never arrives all at once. It comes in fragments, like little shards of porcelain we try to sweep under the rug, pretending they are not there. That is how it began for me. First came the lateness, then the long silences that settled between us, as if there were no more words to bind us. But the worst part was not seeing the signs. The worst part was knowing deep inside that I did not want to see them. I remember the first time I smelled a scent that was not mine. It was a perfume too sweet, a fragrance that did not belong in our house. I was hanging his shirt on the clothesline when I caught that scent that seemed to mock me. My heart turned cold. I closed my eyes and drew a deep breath as if that might wake me from a nightmare. But it was no dream. It was only the beginning of what I would have to bear. He came home late that day. He said he was delayed because the car had broken down on the road. He spoke without meeting my eyes, staring at the floor like a man afraid of being unmasked. I pretended to believe him. I made coffee, set the table, acted as though nothing were wrong. But inside, my soul was twisting. I wanted to ask. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him I was no fool, but my voice would not come. And that was when I understood that my silence was exactly what he most expected of me. Then came other small lies, a meeting that had stretched until the middle of the night, some urgent work that required him to be away for days. I listened to it all with the same face, the face of someone who sees nothing, hears nothing, feels nothing, because I needed time to accept that the man who had once been my safe harbor was no longer the same. There were nights when I would sit in the parlor, the lamp turned off, waiting to hear the key in the door. I counted each beat of my heart, wondering whether he would come home or whether he would invent another excuse. And when he finally arrived, I pretended to be asleep. I could not bear to look into his eyes and find there the reflection of my humiliation. The hardest thing was realizing he believed I saw nothing. He thought I was too busy with the house, the children, the chores of every day. He did not know that while I swept the yard or washed the laundry, my mind was retracing every detail. I relived every conversation, every averted gaze, every gesture he thought went unnoticed. It was as if I were two women, the one who pretended not to know and the one who knew everything already. One afternoon, he came home bringing a gift, a blue handkerchief, embroidered with tiny flowers. He said it was for me. I took that cloth in my hands and felt the weight of his guilt, because a gift given without love is heavier than any stone. I thanked him with a tired smile. I put the handkerchief in the bottom of the drawer. I never used it. It was only another reminder of the lie he insisted on telling, and I pretended to believe. Sometimes I thought it would be easier if he confessed. If he came to me and said he no longer loved me, that he had chosen another path. It hurt to imagine that, but it hurt even more to be treated as blind. I was not blind. I was only waiting for my courage to grow big enough to fit inside my chest. The days went on, and each new detail was a small wound, but constant. A call that stopped the moment I walked into the room. A torn note thrown in the trash. A shirt washed in a hurry. I kept everything inside me, like someone collecting evidence of a crime no one dared to accuse. I know many would say I should have spoken up right away, that I should have laid everything bare. But those who have never lived this sort of silence do not understand it has deep roots. I was afraid of losing everything, afraid to face the shame, afraid to admit I had been deceived under my own roof. And still, every morning when I awoke, I reminded myself it was not I who ought to feel ashamed. It was him. I had not been any less a wife, less a woman, less a person. I had loved with all I had. I had given the best of me, and it was in that certainty that I began to prepare my reply. Not a reply made of shouting, but one of dignity. While he kept pretending, so did I. But the difference was that my pretense had an end date. I only needed to wait for the right day. The day I would look into his eyes and tell him I had always known, and that from that moment on, I would no longer be the woman he thought he could deceive. There was a time when my silence stopped being only fear. It also became my shelter, because as long as I did not speak, I could still pretend there was hope. I clung to that fantasy like someone holding to the riverbank so as not to be swept away by the current. Perhaps it was cowardice, but in those days, it was all I had to keep from falling apart. I remember many nights when he came home late, with that manner of a man carrying more than fatigue. I noticed the scent, noticed the distant look in his eyes, noticed how quickly he went to the bedroom without saying a word. And even so, I stayed there in the kitchen, stirring the broth on the stove as though it had nothing to do with me. I discovered that we build habits even in our suffering. My habit was to stay quiet. There was one day when my neighbor Joaquina came to visit. She had always been sharp-eyed and loose-tongued. She sat with me on the porch, drank coffee, and looked at me in that way only a woman understands. In the end, she sighed and said my face looked different, that I seemed tired of things that would not resolve. I smiled and said it was only the work, the dry weather, the weight of daily chores. But when she left, I cried. I cried because it was true. I was tired. But more than that, I was sad that I had to pretend so much. The days continued all the same. I woke early, made the coffee, took care of the house. When he was there, I pretended to believe his stories. When he was away, I pretended not to notice. It was a routine of small pretense, but inside, I knew that silence was my shield. As long as I did not speak, he did not have to confess. As long as I did not ask, he did not have to lie again. It was an unspoken pact, a truce only those who have loved too much can understand. I began to see that he suffered too. I could see it in his gestures, in the way he avoided my touch. Sometimes he sat at the edge of the bed, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor as if searching for answers that did not exist. I wanted to ask if he was happy away from me. I wanted to ask if she gave him something I could not, but I stayed silent, because back then, I still thought it was my fault. I know that anyone listening to my story might think I was weak, but I was not. I was just a woman who loved so much she could not bear to admit she had been betrayed. I was afraid of shame, afraid of what people would say, afraid of the emptiness that would come if I confessed my marriage was a lie, and that fear was my companion for a long time. There was a night when I could not sleep. I got up, went into the kitchen, and sat in the chair near the cold stove. I sat there, hugging my own doubts, listening to the wind tapping the window. It was that night that I understood my silence did not protect me from anything. It only delayed what I already knew, that nothing would ever be the same. I went back to bed with my heart heavy. He was sleeping, breathing softly, as though nothing was wrong. I laid my head on the pillow and felt a sadness so deep I thought I would never be happy again. But in the middle of that pain, a seed of courage was born. Because it was in that dawn that I promised myself I would not live silent forever. I knew I needed to wait for the right moment. I did not want to speak out of anger or impulse. I wanted to speak when my voice came firm, without trembling. I wanted to say everything looking into his eyes, so he would understand my silence was not ignorance, it was choice. And so, in the days that followed, I kept pretending. But it was no longer the pretense of someone afraid. It was the pretense of someone preparing her own path. While he believed I did not know, I was learning to know myself in a new way. I discovered there was strength in the woman he thought was weak. I discovered that even silent, I still had dignity. And that was how my silence, which had once been cowardice, became my temporary shelter. I know it sounds simple to say it is not our fault, but back then, I did not know. I woke every day wondering where I had gone wrong. Whether it was in the way I loved, whether it was the haste with which life had made me grow old, whether it was in how much I gave without ever keeping anything for myself. I looked in the mirror and no longer saw the girl he had once met. I saw only a tired woman with hands full of calluses and a heart full of doubts. There was a morning when, as I was sweeping the yard, I felt a sadness so deep I had to sit down on the porch bench so I would not collapse. I wondered if he ever thought of me when he was with her. If he remembered my eyes, my voice calling his name. It was a thought that brought me shame, but I could not chase it away. Because betrayal is not only the act, it is also that invisible wound that keeps throbbing in your mind. I was afraid to tell anyone, afraid they would say I deserved it, that I should have been more of a woman, more beautiful, more something. So I kept quiet. I kept quiet because I had no strength to fight against other people's voices. It was already too hard to fight against my own. It was on a Sunday that something changed. I woke early to prepare the coffee. The house was silent. He slept as if nothing weighed on his conscience. I sat at the table, watching the kettle steam, and I thought that I had done nothing to deserve his contempt, that if he had chosen another path, it was because he did not know how to be whole. And it was in that instant I felt the guilt begin to slip off my shoulders. I remembered the girl I had been. I remembered how I used to believe that to love was to give everything, even if the other gave so little. I took pride in being devoted, in being patient. But that day, I understood that devotion is not the same as resignation, that too much patience can turn into consent for what destroys us. And for the first time, I felt a thread of compassion for myself. When he woke, he came into the kitchen and greeted me. I answered with a calm he did not expect. He looked at me warily, as if sensing something had changed, and something had. It was not that I would speak that day. It was still not the moment. But I no longer carried the same burden, because I knew deep inside that I was not to blame for his weakness. That day, I mended an old dress that had torn, and while I passed the needle through the fabric, I thought that, just like that cloth, my heart could also be mended, that I did not have to fall completely apart because of his error. I could choose to remain dignified, even if he did not deserve it. When the afternoon came, I went out to water the plants. The smell of damp earth brought me a peace I had not felt in a long time. I understood that life would go on, whether or not the truth was spoken aloud, and that the woman I was had begun to awaken after a long sleep. It was then I began to prepare my reply. It would not be revenge. It would not be a scandal. It would only be my right to say I had always known, that my silence was not a sign of weakness, but of waiting for the right moment, the right strength. And it was in that strange calm that my freedom was born, because when the guilt left, there was finally space for courage to grow. I always knew there would be a day when my voice would want to come out before its time, a day when silence would no longer fit in my chest, and that day arrived without warning, as all the things we do not expect always do. It was a hot afternoon. The sun scorched the yard, and I had spent the entire morning washing clothes. My hands were wrinkled from so much scrubbing, and so was my heart, tired of waiting for a moment I was not even sure would come. I was hanging the last pieces on the line when I heard the sound of his cart returning. It was not the hour he usually came home, and that alone gave me a tightness in my chest. He got down slowly, his hat in his hand, his face flushed like a man carrying guilt. I pretended not to notice and kept to my work. But inside, my thoughts were shouting that maybe that was the moment to say everything, that I did not have to keep hiding behind calm, that he deserved to hear from my own mouth that I knew, and that I would no longer live as if I were blind. He went into the house, and I stayed outside a few minutes more, breathing deep. Each breath felt like a battle between the woman who wanted to speak and the woman who was not yet ready. When I felt my legs trembling, I set down the laundry basket and went after him. I found him sitting on the kitchen chair, his gaze fixed on the wooden floor. The smell of sweat and road hung in the air. I leaned against the doorframe and stood there, watching. For an instant, he lifted his eyes, and our looks met. And it was in that moment my voice almost came out. I felt the question forming in my mouth. How long will you pretend I do not know? But before I could speak, something inside me told me to wait. I cannot explain why I stayed silent once more. Perhaps because I wanted him to confess without being forced. Perhaps because I did not want to waste all the courage I had gathered in a moment of anger. I wanted, when I finally spoke, for my words to be like a final sentence, not a mere outburst. He lowered his head again, and silence stretched between us. It was a heavy silence, heavier than any scream. I felt my palms grow damp, my chest burn. Inside, it felt like I had run many leagues, but outwardly, I stood motionless. I turned and left the kitchen without saying a word. I went back to the yard and kept hanging the laundry, as though that conversation that had almost happened was only a bad thought I needed to forget. Every clothespin I fixed to the line was a reminder that I was not yet ready, that my reply still needed time to be born whole. When the afternoon turned to dusk, I sat on the porch and watched the sky change color. I thought about everything I had already endured, and all I still would have to endure. And I realized that this waiting was not wasted time. It was only the way my heart prepared itself for the right moment. Because deep down, I knew that the truth could not be spoken any which way. It needed to be told with the dignity I still held. That night, he did not speak to me, and I did not try to start any conversation. We went to bed in silence, each carrying our own burden. But for the first time, I did not feel so weak, because I knew that when I decided to speak, there would be no turning back, and that my voice would be as clear as the sunlight. And that was how I learned that almost speaking is also a kind of courage, because it is on the edge of the abyss that we discover whether we have wings to cross. After that day when I almost told everything, my life returned to its usual rhythm, at least on the outside. I woke early, swept the yard, made the coffee, and fed the chickens. It was as if nothing had happened. But inside me, everything was different. I was no longer the woman who trembled at the thought of telling the truth. I was the woman who knew she could speak at any moment, and that doing so would be my right, not a favor. He, too, could tell something had changed. I saw it in his eyes, in the way he looked at me without knowing what to expect. Perhaps he thought I had grown tired of wondering. Perhaps he believed I would give up wanting to know. But he was mistaken. I already knew. I had always known. What I no longer had was any hurry, because I had understood that my dignity did not have to come with a scandal. The days passed, one after the other, identical in appearance, but inside, each day was another step I climbed toward the moment when there would be no more pretense. I thought of it often as I went about my tasks. While I washed the laundry, I remembered the times he came home late and said he had been working. While I cleaned the stove, I recalled the gifts he brought to cover his guilt. Each memory was proof that I owed him nothing, that my silence was only the time I needed to make myself whole again. One afternoon, a neighbor appeared, saying she had heard talk in the street, that people were saying he had been visiting another house. I listened in silence, my hands folded over my apron. She expected me to grow upset, to deny it, to cry. But I simply said I did not care about gossip, and it was true, because by then, nothing anyone else could tell me would have been new. When she left, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. I thought about how much it had already hurt, and how, in some way, it had begun to hurt less. It was as though I had grown used to the wound, but it was not resignation. It was simply the certainty that I would survive. I had survived every lie, and I would survive the day when the truth would finally be spoken. In those days, I also learned to have more kindness for myself. I, who had always thought first of others, began to think of myself. I started to sew a new dress, not so he would notice me, but because I wanted to feel beautiful again. I began to pray more for my own strength than for his regret. And every night, before sleeping, I told myself that none of this had been my fault. He, on the other hand, grew restless. I could sense his unease each time he came home. It was as if he expected me to explode at any moment, but I did not explode. I smiled when needed. I answered when necessary, and I stayed silent when there was nothing left to say, because I had understood that my answer would not be a scene. It would be a dignified farewell, the kind he least expected. There were nights when I woke and saw he was sitting at the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. I wanted to ask what hurt in him. I wanted to know whether he missed the peace we had once shared, but I stayed quiet, because it was no longer my place to mend what he had broken. That was how I discovered that routine, no matter how simple, can be the best hiding place for a secret. I lived many days pretending everything was the same, but each task done in silence was a way to prepare myself. I knew that when the moment came, I would be ready, and that no one could ever say I had not been strong. At first, each of his lies felt like a blow that knocked the air out of me. I felt my chest tighten, the blood rush to my face, the urge to cry swelling in my throat. I asked myself how someone who slept beside me could look me in the eyes and invent stories with such ease. The worst part was realizing he did not even tremble when he lied. It was as if he had grown used to deceiving. But time, which heals so many wounds, began teaching me something else. His lies no longer had the same power to hurt me. Each made-up story was, at the same time, a wound and a lesson. Because the more he lied, the more I understood that I did not need him to feel whole. It was a slow and sad learning, but it was also the root of the strength I was growing inside. I started paying attention to the words he chose, to the silences that filled the spaces between one sentence and another. And I saw that he, too, was tired. Tired of carrying the guilt, tired of pretending everything was fine. I no longer felt the same anger I once did. I felt pity. Pity to see a man so weak he would rather invent stories than admit his mistakes. Sometimes, I wondered whether he still knew what was true and what was false, because when a person lies too much, He ends up confusing himself with his own inventions. I had never wanted to live that way. I never wanted to be part of a sad theater. But back then, I saw no other way to wait for the right moment. The strangest thing was realizing that my silence began to change its color. At first, it was dark, heavy, full of shame. Later, it grew lighter, softer, until it became something I carried without so much suffering. It was as though my heart had learned that pain did not need to define me, that I could keep living, working, praying, and even laughing, even knowing he was not the man I had dreamed of. There was a morning when he left early, saying he would not return until night. I stayed alone in the kitchen, looking at the empty chair, and felt a peace that surprised me. It was the first time I did not feel afraid to be alone. I understood that my life no longer depended on his presence, and in that instant, I was sure that when I chose to speak, it would not be because I needed to hear apologies. It would simply be because my voice would no longer fit inside my silence. I started writing in an old notebook I kept in the dresser. There I told everything I had no courage to say aloud. I wrote about his lies, about my sleepless nights, about the day I realized none of it had been my fault. Each page I filled was like a part of me standing up again after lying down for so long. When night came, I lit the lamp and sat there, letting my eyes wander over the lines I had written. And there, in that yellow light, I saw the woman I was becoming. A woman who, even wounded, had not lost herself. A woman who, even betrayed, still believed in her own worth. That was how I discovered that each of his lies, instead of destroying me, made me stronger. Because I learned to separate what belonged to him and what belonged to me. I no longer carried the guilt. I no longer carried the shame. I carried only the certainty that one day he would hear my truth, and that when that day came, he would see that all my silence had never been weakness. It had been strength waiting for its moment. I thought I would be afraid until the end of my days, afraid to tell the truth, afraid to look in the eyes of the one who had deceived me so long, afraid to admit to myself that everything I believed had only ever been halfway real. But there came a day when that fear left me the way dust leaves a house when we open all the windows. It was morning, and the sky was so clear it almost hurt my eyes. I had woken before him, as I almost always did. I sat at the edge of the bed, my bare feet on the cold floor, and thought about the woman I had been up to that point. I recalled every silence I swallowed, every night I cried in secret, every excuse he brought into our home as though it were some cursed gift, and I realized I was no longer the same. I got up, went into the kitchen, and set the kettle on the stove. While the water warmed, I rested my hands on the edge of the sink and felt a calm that had never belonged to me before. It was as if my heart had finally found a steady place to rest after so long beating itself raw. I understood in that moment that I was no longer afraid, that everything needing to happen would happen when the time came. When he woke, he found me sitting at the table, drinking my coffee. He wished me good morning with that careful voice of a man treading on ground he no longer trusted. I lifted my eyes and answered him calmly, and in that instant, I saw his surprise. It was as if he had realized something had truly changed. Perhaps he expected me to be nervous, to cry, or to shout, but I no longer felt any of that. I only felt peace. He sat down on the other side of the table, and for a few minutes, we remained in silence. I realized that silence no longer wounded me as it once had, because it was no longer the silence of someone who keeps quiet out of fear. It was the silence of someone who owes nothing, the silence of someone who already knows exactly what she will say when the time comes. I wish I had understood sooner that fear is only a shadow that grows when we pay it too much attention, that it has no real power. But I know everything has its own time. Perhaps I had to walk through every tear to arrive at that morning when I woke without trembling, to feel that I could look at myself and say that I was not small, that I never had been. That day, after he left for work, I went to my old notebook and wrote a sentence I have never forgotten. Today, I am no longer afraid. I closed the notebook, placed it back in the drawer, and felt that this simple gesture was a turning point. Because from that moment on, I was no longer the woman who pretended out of obligation. I was the woman who chose silence simply because she no longer felt the need to speak. I kept to my usual routine. I swept the yard, tended the plants, cooked lunch, but everything felt different. The weight had lifted from my shoulders. I no longer had to wait for the right moment as someone afraid it might never come. I knew that when it came, my voice would come out clear, without hatred, without tears, because the fear that once kept me silent was far behind me. And it was that day I discovered that courage does not arrive all at once. It grows slowly, in quiet, until the day you realize you are no longer afraid of anything. The day I decided to speak was no different from any other, at least to anyone looking from the outside. The sky dawned clear, the birdsong mingled with the smell of fresh coffee, and I woke with the same calm determination as always. But inside me, something had settled in a final way. I knew the time had come to open my mouth and say what I had kept locked away for so long. I did not plan it with myself, did not mark the date. I simply woke knowing I did not want to spend one more night with that silence between us. I felt that if I stayed quiet any longer, I would end up sick with sadness, and I did not want to carry that illness in my heart to the last day of my life. He came home early that afternoon. He wore a tired look, his eyes lowered, his body bent under a guilt that no longer had any place to hide. I was in the kitchen, stirring a pot on the stove, and I did not turn when he entered. But in that moment, I knew it was the right time. My chest no longer ached as before. It did not tremble. I simply wanted to speak. I set the spoon on the table, wiped my hands on my apron, and turned to face him. He stood in the doorway as though he did not know whether to come in or leave. Our eyes met, and I saw he understood this would not be an ordinary day. I began slowly. I said that I knew everything, that I had known for a long time, that I had learned to recognize the scent that was not mine, the silence that said more than any words, the excuses that could not withstand a gaze. I told him I had spent countless nights awake, asking myself where our life had broken, and that after much thinking, I had reached the conclusion that it was not my fault. He tried to say something, but I raised my hand and asked him to let me finish, because in that moment, I did not want to hear apologies. I only wanted him to know that my silence had not been ignorance. It had only been time. Time I needed to become the woman standing before him in that instant. I said I was not going to shout, not going to cry, not going to make a scene, because the dignity I had kept safe for so many years did not deserve to be stained by scandal. I only wanted him to listen, to understand that I had always been aware, and that if I had stayed in that house, it was not from fear. It was because I needed to find my voice before making any decision. He lowered his head. I saw his hands trembling. It was the first time I realized he too was afraid. And strangely, in that moment, I felt no anger. I felt no pity. I felt nothing but a vast relief, like someone setting down a burden carried far too long. I told him I had thought about leaving, many times, but that I wanted to be sure I would not leave small. That when I left, it would be by choice, not by impulse, and that if I stayed, it would be because my heart wanted it, not because I feared loneliness. When I finished, the kitchen fell silent, a different silence, clean. I felt as if the air itself had grown lighter. He lifted his face and tried to say he was sorry. I listened, but I did not answer, because it no longer mattered to me. I no longer needed his regret to feel whole, and that was how I gave my answer. Not a scream, not a tear, only the certainty that I owed nothing to anyone. That day, I knew that whatever path I chose from that moment on, I was already free. After that day when I spoke everything, the house felt different. Not because he had left. He stayed there, sitting in the same chair, sleeping in the same bed. But there was something that no longer lived between us, fear. It was as though I had unlocked a door that had kept my heart imprisoned. And when the lock fell away, I understood that I would never again be the same woman. The first days after my confession were silent. A silence that did not hurt, but only hovered in the air like a rest. I woke early, made the coffee, and no longer needed to pretend I did not see. I saw everything. I knew everything. But, unlike what I had always feared, that awareness did not destroy me. On the contrary, it gave me back to myself. He moved differently too, quieter, more thoughtful. I did not know what went on inside him, and I did not ask. I had already understood that the answers I had chased for so long no longer mattered. I did not need him to explain why he had lied, why he had hidden. I only needed to be sure I carried no guilt at all. One afternoon I sat on the porch and looked out at the yard. The sun shone on the plants, and I thought that, despite everything, this was still my home. The house where I raised my children, where I cooked so many meals, where I had waited so many sleepless nights. And I realized I did not need to run away from it to prove my strength, because the greater courage was not in leaving in a hurry, it was in staying without bowing my head. That day, I decided that my answer had been given and that the rest of the road would be chosen calmly. I did not know if our marriage still existed, if any affection had survived so many years of lies, but I knew that whatever the destination, I was no longer the woman who accepted living small. I began to take better care of myself, to walk to the fence in the late afternoon just to feel the wind on my face, to say my prayers, not asking for him to change, but asking that I never again forget who I was, because I had learned that the worst loneliness was not sleeping alone. It was sleeping beside someone who only pretended to love you. When he tried to justify himself, I listened without interrupting. But it was not because I needed his excuses. It was because I had learned that listening did not make me smaller. I heard his words and let them drift away on the wind. I no longer kept anything that did not belong to me. The neighbors found my quiet strange. Some asked whether I would not take some action. I smiled and said no action needed to be loud to be true. Because deep down, I knew that my decision had already been made the day I stopped being afraid. And that was how I learned that courage is not shouting. It is not making a scene. Courage is speaking when you are ready, and afterward, living in peace with the choice you have made. That day, when I looked at him for the last time and said my silence was over, I was free, and I understood that my greatest victory was not in having discovered the betrayal. It was in having found myself. Are you curious to find out how it all happened? Then subscribe to the channel now and leave a comment telling me where you're listening to this story from. I love to know where you're following me from. And look, if I were you, I wouldn't miss what's coming up. The truth I'm about to reveal will move you in ways you can't even imagine. Are you ready?